Okay, so the next principle that we're going to be discussing is the idea that human reasoning is impotent. So the concept of this principle is that human reasoning is too weak and imperfect and incapable of understanding human existence. Essentially, the existentialist states that our existence is complex. And there are many unanswerable questions simply because they are too sophisticated for us to answer. And the existentialist believes that our human brain is simply incapable of grasping the sophisticated nature of our existence. And we work really hard to try to do that. So we create these ideas, these stories to help answer some of the unanswerable questions. So here you'll see a couple of different images. In the upper left-hand corner, you have Zeus with lightning. So we, before we knew about electricity and the way that weather worked, we believed that Zeus threw down lightning bolts, and it was one of his superpowers. He was on Mount Olympus, and he would throw down lightning bolts. There's many religions have this idea of heaven, of climbing the stairway to heaven, and that there's this idea that there's the golden gates will open and accept those who were good. There's also the concept of hell, that it's a fiery pit where people fall in and it's below us somehow, because we try to grasp this idea of what would be the worst possible thing that a human could go through. So we think of like burning and hell and fire and damnation, and that's what we create this image of what hell is. Before science, our science became sophisticated enough, we used to believe that the earth was flat. Because we didn't really have any reason to suspect otherwise until some of our astronomers were able to look at the shadow of the moon the shadow of the earth on the moon during eclipses. We also had a creation story with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and the creation of sin was because Eve bit into an apple. So we try to solve these complex questions, like what happens when we die? How did we get here? And even just questions that hopefully science will be able to answer someday. And we try to solve them based on our limited understanding of our existence. And as a result, the existentialist states we're never really going to have a true understanding of it because we're just quite simply not that smart enough. So an example of this would be a few years back when my son was 5, there was news stories all over the place that Yardley had been flooded. There was a terrible flooding, and the Delaware Canal had flooded over, and the streets of Yardley were flooded. And there was all of these people on the news, and they were talking about how they were trying to solve this equation and make it so that people can get back into their homes, and when were the waters going to recede, and they were discussing all of these things. Now my son, who was young at the time, used his immature thought process to try to solve the equation. And he turned to me and simply asked, "I don't understand, Mom. Why don't they just pull the plug?" And for him, because of his experience that when water fills up, like in the bathtub, there's a plug that if you just pull the plug, the water will go down. He utilized his understanding of the word to try to solve this question, this mystery. Obviously, we know that it's way more sophisticated than simply pulling the plug from a bathtub to drain all of the water in Yardley. However, because his reasoning was very immature and impotent, he tried to solve the equation with the ideas that he understood. So that's an example. The existentialist states that we try to use our own experience to solve these complex equations. The other part of this is that as humans, we try to understand the nature of man. And the existentialist thinks that this is a futile effort because he says that there are dark places in human life in which there is non-reason. And essentially what the existentialist states is that try as you may, there are just dark spaces inside of humans, and that immorality and evil and bad actions are essentially part of the human existence. And to try to understand why these things occur is as futile as trying to understand our existence, that we are just not sophisticated enough. So the existentialist states that man must be accepted in his whole state. not divided into the good qualities or the bad qualities. Now, for many of us, we like to equivocate our actions as good or bad. That gives us comfort. We like to decide that we're a good person or a bad person. The existentialist states that it is human nature to be both bad and good, and that we shouldn't separate those things. So this is an interesting principle. Again, it's the idea that human reasoning is impotent and that we just really honestly are incapable of understanding some of those unanswerable questions.